Thank you, Leith, and thank you to the other two incredibly well-informed speakers. I've recently been reading a book, especially since moving to Indonesia in November. And if you haven't read it, Krakatoa by Simon Winchester, the story of the greatest natural disaster in recorded history, is a fascinating read. And what it tells us about is the phenomenon, and quite recently discovered phenomenon, of plate tectonics. The Earth's crust is made up of, I'm sure you know, it's not static, it's made up of giant plates which are moving around, caused by convection within the core of the Earth. The result of plate tectonics is that the plate on which Australia sits and the plate on which Indonesia sits are moving together at the rate of about 10 centimetres a year, or 100 metres every 1,000 years. So by my rough calculations, if we wait 15 million years or so, the two countries will be roughly together. But we haven't got that long. The other thing that Winchester's book explains is the issue of the subduction zone, where these two plates collide. So we have Australia, right hand, and Indonesia, and the Australian plate, being heavier, is dropping underneath the Indonesian plate, or the North Asian plate, and Indonesia's on top, but I won't explore that further. The gift that this subduction zone and the Australian plate going underneath bequests to Indonesia is the line of volcanoes. So, Paheri, in your hometown, in a way, Australia's gift to you is Gunung Merapi. And just as we do experience these great tectonic shifts of enormous power but very slow progress, we are also experiencing a much more rapid tectonic shift in the world economic order. And the exciting thing is that Australia and Indonesia are part of that. Now, as we've heard from speakers, Australian and Indonesia's economies are doing very well indeed. And we also have heard and we know that there are strong complementarities between the two. But so far they're successful largely in parallel and not working together. And the objective of us all being here at this conference, I think, is to see how we can together cause the Australian and Indonesian economies to work much better together to each other's benefit. Why haven't they been working together? The reasons are complex, but as we have heard, Australians tend to both physically and mentally fly across Indonesia to China, and we heard about China addiction. And Indonesian businesses face a wonderful market of 240 million people at home and an ASEAN market right on their doorstep, and they tend to look inward and north rather than south. So the CEPA is going to be a very important facilitator of overcoming what economists call that market failure, for different reasons in the two different countries, to bring those businesses together and to bring the two economies together. And as the President of Indonesia said in the hotel next to this one just a year ago, the private sector needs to lead the economic cooperation. He said government's role is as a facilitator. The private sector has the job to lead economic cooperation. Now, what we've heard in particular from Paheri, it is important to realise that the two countries are quite different. They've got similarities, but they've also got cultural and business differences and political differences. And the negotiations need to ensure that we each understand the issues that the other country faces. And earlier today, Pat Mahendra, the Vice Minister for Trade, emphasised the need to take business along with the process, and Paheri re-emphasised that and talked about bringing society as a whole along. We've heard how the vision for the IA-CEPA is for a comprehensive economic partnership beyond simply trade into a lot of other facets of economic cooperation. And a very important part, the part Harry talked about, is promoting, not only promoting business linkages, helping to improve business competitiveness, but also building capacity by providing technical assistance in trade and investment policy and in economic governance. And there's a lot of work in that field going on now, and as other speakers have pointed out, some good potential for that to be extended. But Harry said that, or he outlined for us a history of this CEPA, going back to discussions between the then Australian Trade Minister Mark Vaile and Mari Pangestu, the current Indonesian Trade Minister. We change ours more often than Indonesia does. They've been talking since 2005. And so it's important to note that this is not just an idea that has occurred. This has been a long, considered process. And that's important in terms of the stakeholders in both countries being comfortable. The IA-CEPA, as we have heard from both Michael and Harry, needs to encompass a broad range of mechanisms and well beyond trade. And in particular, it needs to involve very strong business engagement. Now, this is something that I think has been a work in progress in Australian trade negotiations. When I first became involved in the field, business engagement wasn't terribly good. It's got better and better. This IA-CEPA, I think, is going to involve business even more closely than most other negotiations that have preceded it. So the process, indeed, for negotiation and for engagement of business is as important, I think, as the content of the IA-CEPA, because we can use it to overcome the market failures that I have been talking about. We can use the process to help bring business together, and then business picks the ball up and runs with it while even the negotiations are progressing. And to that end, it was good to hear about the MOU between Kadin and ACCI, which is proposed. I think I should leave it there to leave a few minutes for questions. And I'll just finally say that, going back to the question of tectonic shift, past Australia-Indonesia economic relationships have moved extremely slowly indeed and haven't resulted in any Mount Merapis of business activity between the two countries. Time will tell, and our efforts, both business and government, will be very strong determinants of whether this IA-CEPA indeed is the start of a tectonic shift in Indonesia-Australia economic relations. Thank you. Now, because of Leith's mistimed disability, I've been asked to facilitate Q&A. And so I think, given that, you should ask all of the questions to these two learned gentlemen in Harry and Michael McGliston. And I open the floor for questions or comments in the few minutes that we have left. Questions?
Judy Anderson from IBM. Our interest is naturally in services, and so have you got any thoughts at the moment how services will play out in this agreement, given they will be AIBC plus? What sort of areas could we go into? Have you got some ideas floating around that we could perhaps play with? Because I know the Indonesian economy, they want to grow services by some 13 to 14% per annum over the next, over the period of their economic plan. So Indonesia has an ambitious services agenda, so interested to hear what the agreement might achieve to facilitate that.
In a nutshell, the AIBC, I'm sorry, it's a terrible acronym actually, Dr. Emerson doesn't like that, but I've noticed he started using it actually. But it's ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA. That it is a very substantial outcome on tariffs, that is in terms of goods trade. And what that essentially reflects and it's not so much the case with respect to services. And what that essentially reflects is the fact that ASEAN has made a lot more progress in terms of its own economic integration on goods rather than services. I mean, they have this process of the ASEAN framework agreements on services aimed at achieving this integration, but it's taking time. So really, if you apply the concept of ANZFTA Plus in terms of looking at the CEPA, in terms of the traditional trade areas of goods and services trade, you would think that I've already noted in terms of tariffs, it's a very substantial outcome with Indonesia eliminating tariffs on 93.2% of its tariff lines by 2025. Then there's some scope, of course, to improve on that, but a lot more scope on services. This is clearly, it's been reflected in some of the submissions that we've received, strong interest in the Australian industry sector. What I would encourage are further submissions also identifying your interests, those are important inputs that we can follow up with you as well. And what we're keen to do, Harry and I have been talking about this and picking up your theme, Ian, in terms of industry being even more engaged, is where possible, we'd like to we're going to have negotiating rounds involving government-to-government negotiations. But where possible, we would like to schedule seminars back-to-back with some of those negotiating rounds. So we could, for example, have a seminar on services, and it's not a negotiating session, it's simply an opportunity for stakeholders to come and talk about the benefits of, in fact, deregulating or liberalising the sector, and to also draw on Australia's own experiences. And there's some very interesting case studies. I don't know whether John Denton's still here. It all looks pretty black to me out there at the moment. But it's a very interesting case study in looking at what we've done in terms of legal services, for example, going back to the 1980s, how there was the progressive opening up of the legal profession in Australia, and how that has in fact benefited the Australian economy to the point where we're now actually exporting legal services. So that's just one case study, but we could look at a number. But sorry, I get very enthusiastic about services, Harry, but you go first. Second.
Thanks for your intervention, your question on services. I just want to be brief. As other developing countries, services is a new subject, particularly when we discuss about market access on that sector. I learned from my experience when I was involved in the negotiation in ASEAN, ASEAN Korea, ASEAN Japan, ASEAN ASEAN India, ASEAN Australia, New Zealand with Michael, as well as our as well as in the process in the multilateral fora, in WTO, DDA agenda, and bilaterally. So since this is a new subject on trade negotiation, like intellectual property, for example, investment, we are still in the process of increasing our knowledge on that subject. It's not easy for Indonesia to not only to respond to the request from other countries, but also in preparing our requests to other countries. So we have to identify services sectors in Indonesia. This is my quick response on your question. Thank you.
All right, look, on that note, I'm afraid we can't take any more questions in this session.